For this week's video, we're going to be painting Cad Bane from Star Wars Legion. Star Wars Legion has great miniatures and they're a joy to paint, so I can't wait to get stuck in. But before I do, I'm actually going to work on the base of this model first. I'm going to attempt to make a Tatooine base for Cad Bane today, and I don't really make custom bases very often. I pretty much just add texture paste and call it a day, like I did on the Kroot Warshaper in the last video. Part of my plan to improve is to get better at doing bases though, so I really wanted to push myself outside of my normal comfort zone on this one. To get started, I used a cork sheet and I cut it to the size of the base. And I used the base itself as a guide to help me do this. Once I had a piece of cork that matched the size of the base, I began to cut into it with my clippers to get the shape I wanted. When I tested that, I realised I just made a cork version of Pac-Man, so I knew I needed to cut more away. I was also testing the base against the miniature to check that his feet would actually stand on it. After I cut a wider angle, I added a smaller piece on top, which I hoped would create this natural stepped sloping terrain. When I was satisfied, I glued it down, and this is what I was left with. The next thing I did was something I've never done on a base before, and that was I decided to use milliput. After mixing the two parts together, I shaped the milliput into small sausages which I used to squeeze in between the cork and the base. Once in place, I used a sculpting tool to push it in firmly. I was also trying to achieve a rocky texture, so I used lots of different tools to scrape various lines and rough ridges into this milliput. And I did the same thing for the second level as well. And with those layers done, I had this. At this point, I wasn't even sure if this was good or not. This is the first time I'd used milliput for anything other than filling a tiny gap, so I just trusted the process. After that, I added a sand texture paste to everything. With hindsight, I probably shouldn't have added it to the top step, just so I could leave that as a more rocky texture. And I think it's good to point out the things I learned from this process and the things I would do differently, so that if you try something like this, you can do it better than I did. And after covering the whole thing, I had a base that looked like this. At this point, I was happy with the shape, so I began to paint. But before I started painting, I had to put down a layer of primer, so I used an AK grey primer, but I just added it with a brush. I would normally prime my models with a spray, but I didn't have anything else ready to be primed right now, so I just decided to add it with a brush because I thought that would be quicker and easier. I included this clip because it represents that I had almost no idea how to paint this base. I knew I wanted a Tatooine colour scheme, I looked online at a load of reference images, but I just didn't know exactly what colour paints I needed to use to achieve the pictures I was looking at. One thing I did know I wanted was to use lots of different colours. I wanted to have brown tones and yellow tones and some pinky tones in this colour scheme in order to try and get a more realistic looking sand environment. I began by laying down orange brown on the rocky step areas. Then I added tan flesh by Pro-Acryl to the upward facing surfaces. On my initial pass, I thought that was a bit too pink, and so I wanted to add some yellow. So I used dark sand from Vallejo, and I just added that roughly over the top. After that, I wanted to add a much darker colour to the base, so at the very bottom of all the rocky step areas, I added Gorgon brown. And I just want to remind you that I didn't really have a clue what I was doing here. I was hoping that this would work out. So then I added an even darker colour, charred brown, to the very lowest points. One of my hopes for the base was that I could tie it all together with a very strong dry brush over the top. But before I did that, I wanted to add in more yellow again. I really wanted depth of colour underneath the dry brush that I planned to add. So I made sure I spent a while adding in different hues of brown and yellow and even a bit of pink again to create a lot of depth in the base. I actually think the base was looking alright at this point, but for some reason I added even more yellow I think I was thinking at the time that I wanted even more colour depth before my big dry brush. So then I did my dry brush with dark sand from Vallejo all over the top. I think this really helped to bring the colours together and to make the whole thing look more sandy. Things were a bit too yellow at this point, so I went back in with a brush and I added a bit more of a pink beige tone, and I scattered it all about randomly. The previous step covered a lot of the dry brush I did, so I had to reapply the dry brush once again. Then I took pale sand from Vallejo and I dry brushed that with a softer dry brush so that it covered slightly less than the previous layer. With those steps finished, this is what I was left with. This was starting to shape up, but I think I needed to do a few more steps to enhance it. So for a while I added some brown tones to the rocky areas to try and increase the contrast from the sand. To finish off the base, I added a black coat around the rim. And this is what I ended up with. For my first ever attempt at a base like this, I don't think it turned out that bad. So now I've got to move on to paint the whole rest of the miniature. In this clip, I wanted to show all the different paints that I was looking at. There's quite a lot of them, there's quite a few of them. And to be honest, that wasn't all of them. I didn't have any blue paints there for the skin tones or anything like that, so I had way too many paints for this paint job. In that previous clip, I was just using dryad bark to base coat some of the chest, and then I'm using that on the hat as well. And then I go in and I add my base coats across the whole miniature. I'm using charcoal from Vallejo for the metals and any of the dark parts like the trousers. And I'm using rhinox hide for the legs, mornfang brown for the jacket, and I use a mix of midnight purple from Vallejo with a bit of black for the arm thingies that he has. For the final step of base coating, I added imperial blue from Vallejo's game color range to the face and the fingers. Once I've done that, I have something like this. And then it was time to move on. What you can see on my palette is a gradient mixed between dryad bark and ushabti bone. I'm using ushabti bone to highlight the chest part, so I started layering up areas that would be brighter on the small parts of the chest. I then worked my way up slowly, working from almost pure dryad bark to almost pure ushabti bone. By the time I was using mostly ushabti bone, I was using a very tiny amount of the paint, just touching my brush to the very highest points with only a tiny bit of that colour. I think I was a bit too aggressive with the highlight in the beginning, so I did a stage where I came back with the mid-tone and I tried to make my highlight lines a little bit thinner. After that, I decided to shade his jacket, and I used rhinox hide to go underneath all the parts of the jacket that would be hidden in shadow. I also applied that to all the downward facing surfaces on the chest underneath all of the details. Back to my wet palette now, and I wanted to show that I was making a mix between the mornfang brown base coat and Vallejo's light brown colour. I started applying that to the jacket, but I really struggled here, and the jacket was quickly becoming my arch nemesis in this paint job. I ended up trying to paint the jacket quite a lot of times. I even reset a few times in the future, which you'll see at least one of those times, and yeah, the back of that jacket was an extremely difficult thing. For now, I'm highlighting all the front parts that are a bit easier, just picking out all the details and running the brush along the edges. Because I was using the gradient on the palette, I just kept using increasingly brighter amounts with more light brown in them to highlight. I think one of my main issues here was that this back part of the jacket, it's kind of all facing upwards, but still has these recessed dips in it, and I couldn't work out how dark I needed those recessed dips to be. So because of that, I decided to leave the jacket where it was and move on to other things, coming back to it later to try and fix it. Looking at the box art, his gun holster parts seemed to be a slightly different type of brown, so I used an orange brown to highlight those areas instead of the light brown that I used on the jacket. Next, I highlighted his trouser parts. I used a lighter grey. I think I added castle grey from my warm greys and white sets that I used in my Crude Warshaper video, and I added that to the charcoal from Vallejo that I'd used before. To highlight the Rhinox hide on the legs, I used leather brown from the Army Painted Fanatic range. And once again on this, I used the leather brown added to the Rhinox hide as a mix rather than the leather brown straight from the bottle. And after that stage, I decided to have a look and see how things had turned out so far. But then it was straight onto highlighting those boots and the dark charcoal parts on those, and I highlighted them with the same warm grey tone mixed into the charcoal base coat. To highlight all the metallic parts on the model, I used the non-metallic metal steel set from AK Interactive. That paint set has a colour called anthracite grey, which is the paint that I'm now using to cover the metallic parts. This would create a subtle difference between these metallic parts and the boots and the trousers. The next paint in the AK Interactive set is graphite, so I used that to then highlight the anthracite grey. I'm still not really great at non-metallic metal, so this was good practice for me. This model has small details, which makes it easier for me to just pick out the edges, which make up most of this non-metallic metal effect. Cad Bane has these strange purple armband things. They're not always purple. In different media, they're shown in different ways, but the box art shows them as purple, and I really like that splash of colour. So I added a bit of alien purple to my midnight purple base coat, and then I applied that as a chunky highlight. And I knew that I'd be coming in with a thinner highlight of more alien purple in the future. Next up, it was time to give some attention to the face. And so I used Magic Blue from Vallejo, and I added that over the Imperial Blue base coat. For his mouth-nose area, I just did a triangle around the edge of it, and then I highlighted the lips and the eyebrows and all of the eyelids around the eyes as well. For his eyes, I used Angelic Red from Army Painted Fanatic and just was very careful to dot that in between the eyelids. Next up, I highlighted the legs with a second highlight, and I used pure leather brown for this. As usual, I just covered a smaller area than the previous highlight. And here's what the miniature looks like at this stage. After doing all that, I decided it was time to come back and try and fix this jacket. As I said before, the thing that really confused me here was that a lot of the back of the jacket is facing upwards, and so the recesses couldn't be that dark compared to the lights because everything's facing upwards, but there still has to be some definition, so the slightly higher surfaces need to be highlighted a bit more, and I couldn't really get that into my head very easily, so I struggled back and forth many times. You'll even see here, after working on the back a bit to reduce the highlights there, I then completely rebase coated the back of the jacket. This is actually the first or second time that I did that. I did it twice overall. But before we get to that, I did jump back to the face again just to do that final highlight. I used Sunrise Blue from Vallejo, and I just used it to touch the tiny little edges of his eyelids, of his eyebrows, the top of his nose, and just went around that triangle that he has for his nose-mouth area. Because the Sunrise Blue paint was quite desaturated and powerful, I decided to go back in with some Magic Blue to glaze in gently some of that colour, just to create a bit more saturation in that nose and mouth area. Which left me with a face that looked like this. It was time to do the tiny details on the jacket, so I used the graphite paint in the non-metallic metal steel set to do a first highlight on these parts. I forgot to highlight the fingers with magic blue, so I went in and did that next. And I followed that up with some sunrise blue just for the final highlights. It was then time to do the second highlight on the armband things, and I used more alien purple in my mix to brighten it up. I might have even used pure alien purple for this, and I used very thin lines to highlight all around them. To enhance the non-metallic metal effect on the guns and all the other metallic parts, I used silver grey from the non-metallic metal set I mentioned earlier, and added that as a final highlight to the weapons and all the other metal parts. This is what the guns look like after I finish them. I'm still working on my non-metallic metal skills, so, you know, in the future I could probably blend a bit better the colours and try and make smoother transitions. I continue highlighting all the metal parts like the tubing around his head, and his like backpack breather thing that he has. And then I highlighted all the tiny details on the jacket as well. I also went down to the boots and added this brightest highlight on the jet booster parts and the metallic ridges in front of the shin. I decided to go for another step of highlight on the arm thingies, and so I used silver grey mixed with some of my alien purple to create an even brighter highlight that I used only on the tiniest corners and edges. And finally, I decided it was time to return and try and fix the back of the jacket. After the base coat being reapplied to do a reset, I decided to come in and edge highlight with a lighter colour. On my failed attempts, I had gone too wide or too chunky with the highlights and too dark on the recesses, so with this attempt I really wanted to just try and keep the lines of the highlights extremely thin and just on the top of the ridges of the jacket. And I just wanted to do very subtle shading, so the goal here was to try and be very subtle in shading, very thin on the highlights, and just to keep working on it until I eventually got something I was happy with. Because this process took me so long and I spent so much time going back and forth on the colours, I've sped this clip up a lot, but I still wanted to be able to show some of this process of me just trying to work on it for a while, working on shadows, highlights, and everything in between to try and get the effect I wanted. Looking back, I think I was just struggling with the fact that this area was all upwards facing, and so even the recesses need to be quite bright. But finally, after I got to somewhere I was okay with, I started to do final details, and that started with dotting some red on the scopes of the guns. Then I used charred brown, barbarian skin, and off-white from Vallejo to try and make a non-metallic metal bronze effect on the top of the guns. Looking online at reference pictures, it was really hard to tell what this colour actually was, so this was just my best guess. Thankfully, the area is also really small, so I didn't have to do too much here to try and sell the effect. When I had finished them, I was quite happy. It was quite a subtle difference in colour, but it was okay. For some finishing touches, I used a pure white on some of the metallic parts, just edge highlighting some of the areas on the jet boosters, and then I moved on to the hat. Cad Bane's hat is iconic and a great part of his look, so I wanted to do it justice, which meant I wanted to do a bit of texture on the hat so that it wasn't just one big plain brown surface. So I took a bit of a mix between my highlight and my base tone, and I did a bit of an effect similar to what I did on one of my shorts where I painted Avoid War Base. Following doing a bit of the leather highlighting with that leather brown colour on the Rhino's hide, I then went and did some non-metallic stuff on the hat as well. For this, I used the same non-metallic metal set from AK, but I didn't want to draw too much attention to the edges on the hat, so I think I just used anthracite grey and a little bit of graphite, and then maybe a final highlight of silver grey, but no white. And with that done, I called the hat finished. So I glued it on his head and the miniature was complete. I hope you enjoyed watching me go through the process of making the base and painting the miniature, sticking them together and ending up with a result like this. Despite some of the struggles along the way, I think he's turned out great and I'm really happy with him. I really hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you'll join me in the next one.